Daughters and gentle friends, welcome to That Final Girl Life. It's your favourite final girl here, taking you through the horrors and out the other side to find out what life is really like after the movie ends. I can't believe I need to say this, but apparently it's a whole thing now. I am an actual real live human being, not an AI. I physically write all my scripts. I watch the movies at least twice before I do an episode on them. Any resources I use, like other people's articles which I've found helpful, will be in the show notes. In this episode, we'll be discussing a movie from my letterboxd list, If You Hate Your Mother, Then You'll Love This Film. The Voices of Our Mother is an occult horror about the monstrousness of family, with a quiet and understated final girl, Annika. Please be aware that there will be spoilers throughout the episode. In this episode, I'll be talking about demons, religion, child abuse, intergenerational trauma, monstrous mothers, sibling rivalry, wellness retreats, drug addiction, gambling, and of course, PTSD. I'll also be discussing self-harm in some depth. And I'll mention up front that my incredibly dark sense of humour starts to come out in this episode. It's got me through a lot in my life and I refuse to apologise for it, but I do understand that for some people it's too much, and if that's you, fair enough, you don't have to listen. Ready? Pack your bags and get ready to visit a truly horrific family home as we gather around the dying matriarch of The Voices of Our Mother. The movie opens with a growling masculine voice repeating the words, "You are mine and no one else's." We will hear this several times throughout the film. Our main characters are a mother named Harriet and her 4 grown-up children, fraternal twins Therese and William, Martin the black sheep, and Annika the nun. Already an intense family setup. The siblings are getting together because Harriet has had a stroke and they need to sort out what to do about her medical care. It's the first time they've seen each other in years, and their grandmother, who always looked after their mother, has just died. It's obvious that none of them want the responsibility of caring for their mother. We get the sense that there's a good reason for that, although we don't find out what it is until much later on. The hospital discharges their mother, who despite having all the symptoms, shows no sign of a stroke on any tests. The siblings take her back to the family home while they try to work out what to do with her, but they can't agree on anything, and after a while we see that her very presence in the house prompts them to argue with each other. Gradually we realise she's possessed. The local vicar tries to help, but there's a strong suggestion that it's Satan himself she's possessed by, rather than your average run-of-the-mill demon. At one point, Annika confesses to the others that she knew about this all along. Before she died, her grandmother had asked Annika to keep reciting a prayer which would help to keep both her mother and the rest of the family safe from the demon. But Annika had instead left and become a nun, which makes a lot of sense if the thing you're running from is the literal devil. Things reach a boiling point when all the siblings end up dying, apart from Annika, who is left in a burning home with no one there to help her. Struggling through the flames, she finds herself trapped with her back against a wall as the devil approaches. It no longer looks anything like her mother. Throughout the film, she's been told that a protective prayer needs to be recited by someone who truly loves the possessed person, even despite all the terrible things they do. Ultimately, Annika manages to summon this love, probably because of her time spent as a nun, and the demon recedes as her mother becomes visibly human once more, weak, naked, and in a fetal position on the floor. The movie ends with Annika carrying Harriet outside to safety, where she stands in front of the burning building, holding her mother in her arms. It's a complicated story. The first time I watched it, I didn't like it, but it grew on me with a rewatch, as things sometimes do. It felt like a premise I should enjoy. I like religious and occult horror in general, and I love an intergenerational trauma horror. I guess the first time around, I found the horror elements a little overblown. I don't need to see an actual devil walking through fire near the end. And I also found the moral, if there is one, a little problematic. The moral of the movie seems to be forgiveness at all costs. And not just forgiveness, but acceptance of evil, which I don't agree with and is probably kind of beyond what the director was aiming for anyway. Horror is a hyperbolic genre by nature, and this may have been a case of over-egging something for cinematic effect. But given how people tend to speak to survivors of abuse, I didn't feel totally comfortable with it. Child abuse runs through the film as a central theme. We learn that each of the siblings left their mother and never went back because she was passively complicit in abuse perpetrated by their father. Each of them avoided dealing with their trauma in different ways. William by gambling, Therese by going to endless retreats, Martin with drugs, and Annika with religion. I particularly liked the inclusion of Therese and Annika's methods of not dealing with their problems, because these are often seen as positive things, which of course they can be, but anything that can help can also harm. The dose makes the poison, as Paracelsus said thousands of years ago. I've been thinking about this movie from my dual perspective as a trauma therapist and a survivor of familial abuse. The things we see as helpful and harmful are interesting, as are the dosages, I guess you could say, of our particular coping mechanisms. I've always been intrigued by people's views of different kinds of self-harm. Having survived sex trafficking in childhood, it's no surprise that I self-harmed a lot as a teenager, but the different ways in which I self-harmed were received very differently by the people around me. For example, I used to cut myself. Classic, I was a goth in the early 2000s, it was all the rage. But it is so badly understood by most people, in my experience. A lot of people assume that people who self-harm, especially teenagers who self-harm, are, quote, doing it for attention. But what does that even mean? I remember feeling really proud of myself as a teenager for being exceptionally good at keeping my self-harm hidden, even though it was in a really obvious place, on my wrists. No one ever asked, even the parents who saw me in pyjamas when I went to their house for sleepovers. Looking back, I can see how very smug I was about it, which did not come from a place of kindness to myself or anyone else. I felt smug because I definitely wasn't doing it for attention, I told myself, because if I made sure no one saw it, then I couldn't be, right? I actually still think attention wasn't the goal for me at that time. It was more about seeing the blood for myself. But I had a conversation one day with one of my teachers which made me consider the concept of attention differently. We were talking about a friend of mine who had visible evidence of self-harm all over her arms. At school, I was often paired up with the so-called troubled kids because I was super well behaved and a giant nerd, but also a little bit punk rock and therefore acceptable to the various social strata you find within UK high schools. Teachers presumably thought I was absolutely fine since I was getting straight A's, an assumption I'll come back to in a minute, and so they'd ask me to supervise students whose behaviours were more disruptive to whatever class we were in. Some of those kids became close friends of mine, and one of those close friends was visibly a self-harmer, and so my teacher was inquiring about her one day and mentioned her self-harm scars. "She's obviously doing it for attention," I scoffed in a moment of teenage bitchiness. "Well, I don't know about that," said my teacher, "but if she is doing it for attention, then maybe she really needs some attention." This absolutely blew my tiny mind. The idea that people might genuinely need attention, that it might be okay to ask for it even, was something that was very much not a belief in my household. My mother once got angry with her stepsister for crying at her own father's funeral. To say we weren't supposed to get emotional or ask for attention in our family is an understatement. So hearing my teacher's response to my judgmental comment gave me a totally new perspective on not just my friends' needs, but my own. Of course, I still never asked for help. What, do you think I'm crazy? Well, yeah, I was, but in different ways. And the primary mode of self-harm I found was becoming a workaholic, which is an interesting one because although we do talk about it a bit, we don't give it nearly the same weight as things like alcoholism and cutting yourself, even though in the UK, roughly 180,000 people per year die from workaholism, which is 23 times the number of annual alcohol-related deaths. And, as Gary Johnston points out in a Medium article, that figure doesn't take into account things like heart attacks which are either brought on or hastened by work-related stress. I worked hard at school. By the time I got to sixth form, people did start asking questions and mentioning that they were worried, primarily, I think, because I was also losing a lot of weight. Yep, that's right, an anorexic self-harmer in the early 2000s. So very original. But when I went into the workplace, although people would occasionally express concern, in general my capacity to work most of the day every day coupled with my lifelong insomnia, made me a perfect employee. Give it to Shindy, she doesn't sleep, she'll get it done before morning. And they weren't wrong. All of which is to say, there are ways of self-harming and running away from problems which we disparage, like alcoholism and gambling and cutting yourself, and then there are ways which we accept or even praise, like workaholism, being very into so-called wellness, and historically, certain types of religion. That doesn't mean that any of those things are bad in and of themselves. Enjoying your job is great. I enjoy doing this. I enjoy my PhD. If you're going to spend a lot of time on something, then it's useful to at least like it. Going on a retreat every so often can be a welcome break from the world and a useful opportunity for reflection. Religion, all religions, can have a really positive mental health effect on their followers. Likewise, having a glass of wine every now and then can be a nice way to spend an evening. Taking some Molly at a party and feeling like you love everyone who's there can be very, very nice. But the extremes of these things can be really harmful. All of them. Yes, even wellness. Don't get me started. And I guess that brings me to both what I liked and disliked about The Voices of Our Mother. I liked that it didn't only give the obvious examples of gambling, drugs and alcohol as the siblings' vices. I appreciated the inclusion of wellness and religion. And I liked the nuance with which Annika's calling was addressed. It was evident that she had gone to join the convent at least partly as a way to escape the request to look after her mother, but it was also evident that the convent genuinely provided her with something, as did her relationship with her God. There's a lot of nuance to life which is really easy to overlook, especially in the social media scrolling age. Annika's religion was an escape, yes, but it was also something she really believed in, something which helped her through life, and which ultimately allowed her to save both herself and her mother at the end of the film. Nonetheless, I found the message of forgiveness a bit heavy-handed. It did seem to be saying that it was somehow Annika's responsibility to rescue her mother from the consequences of her own actions, which I just don't agree with. I appreciated hearing director Mark O'Brien's interview with Screenfish, in which he clarified that he isn't necessarily trying to claim that everyone needs to forgive their parents in every instance, or to forgive them in the same way. But in that interview, he does talk about love triumphing over evil and hatred, and whilst I know nothing about him or his past, it does make me wonder how much actual evil he has encountered personally. Both of my parents nearly killed me, deliberately. Both of my parents have child trafficking cases open against them with the police. Well, my dad's is presumably closed now since he's dead. But they're both dangerous people, especially to children and others who are vulnerable, and I would argue that you're always vulnerable to the people who made you vulnerable in the first place. Which I suppose is addressed in the movie to an extent. The relationships between the siblings have some really interesting dynamics. I wasn't surprised to learn that O'Brien himself is one of 4. And during the main part of the movie, we're shown how the mother's presence invokes rivalry amongst the siblings, and how her demons seem to feed off of their antagonism towards each other. Something about being back in the house with their mother is bad for all of the siblings. In fact, that's a huge understatement. 3 of them end up dead. But that speaks to why I find the message of the movie a bit problematic. Because I have lived in an extremely abusive environment, and because I've spent my entire adult life working with people who are abused as children as well, I know all too well just how realistic it is for 3/4 of the people who have experienced the horrors to end up dead. There was a post going around the other day on social media in which people were naming the top 3 things that were the most likely to kill them if they died in the same way as most of their family members. And I realised that whilst the majority of people were naming different types of cancer or heart disease, my top 2 were being killed by another family member or dying by suicide as a direct result of childhood sexual abuse. 3rd was bowel cancer. Finally, something normal to look forward to. So showing Annika's capacity to love her mother, not just love her but rescue her despite it all, felt to me kind of dangerous, actually. So many of us who are estranged from our families have to deal with people making inane statements like, "Oh, but she's your mother, she loves you," when they are in fact incorrect. And honestly, even if they're right that on some level some abusive parents love their kids, that doesn't mean they're safe for those kids to be around. It took cutting off contact with my mother for me to even come to understand the degrees and types of abuse that had happened to me when I was younger. And that's despite me literally being a trained psychotherapist who specialises in trauma and abuse, who spent her whole adult life, as well as much of her childhood, learning about it. Getting out of the cycle of abuse often requires us to get out of the cycle of abuse. I wouldn't be emphasising this point quite so much if the movie had been less heavy-handed and more metaphorical, but it literally describes the father abusing his children while the mother stands by. So she's, at the very least, not a protector. And whilst I agree that there will be reasons for that, and not all of those reasons will be the mother's fault, nonetheless, it's still her responsibility as a parent to take care of her children. And if you don't do that, then you can't rightfully expect those children to stick around and look after you later on. So, that's what I think as a therapist and a final girl. But what do I think about how Annika will be now that she's survived the main events? Well, kind of the same thing. Annika has been through hell in this film. She's left the convent, her place of safety and order and quiet, gone back to her family home, dealt with her siblings, faced up to a literal demon, and rescued her mother from a burning building. She is, to put it mildly, not going to be okay. I wondered whether the fire was supposed to be purifying on a spiritual level. There's a lot of stuff in the Bible about that, and given how Harriet and the Hell Creature ended up during the final scenes, it's plausible that we're supposed to believe Harriet is no longer possessed. This would make her a lot easier to look after. But the thing is, regardless of whether or not she's actually possessed by a demon anymore, Harriet's not going to spring back to being someone else entirely. From what we're led to believe, Harriet has always been possessed. She was adopted into the family, and there is more than a suggestion that the evil is something inside her blood. I could go off on one here about how orphans and adopted children are often used as shorthands for evil in horror stories, even though in real life they're usually victims of the horrors. But I won't. Where was I? Oh yeah. From childhood onwards, Harriet's mother kept her safe with a seemingly constant regime of church attendance and fervent prayer. With all of that supporting her, Harriet managed to be almost normal, albeit severely neglectful of her children's needs. Without it, well, we saw what happened without it. If the demon's gone for good, then hopefully the ongoing prayer and church-going won't be necessary. Although if anyone's going to be capable of that, it'll be Annika, which the grandmother realised when she instructed her about how to care for Harriet. But even then, Harriet isn't exactly going to be able to live a normal life. She's been in a childlike state looked after by her mother for her whole life until very recently. She's got various strange health concerns which may or may not be demon-related. Beyond that, she's recently lost the mother who cared for her, and has now also lost 3 of her 4 children in a sequence of events which were kind of her fault. I listened to a couple of interviews with Mark O'Brien in which he talked about the parallels between possession and dementia, something I really liked about the film. He talked about how possession movies usually feature children as the ones who are being possessed, and how in dementia people tend to regress to a more childlike state, and therefore he thought it would be interesting to look at possession of someone who had dementia. I don't have personal experience of dealing with dementia, but speaking to friends who have looked after parents in that state, I can see some of the similarities. People with dementia, as I understand it, can get suddenly violent, can lose any kind of filter between what they think and what they say, can become physically or verbally abusive even if they haven't been that way before. So for Annika, looking after Harriet is for sure going to be a challenge. The way she carries her out of the burning building in the final scene has more than a touch of reverse parenting about it. Harriet is being held like a baby by her daughter, something which I think will feel familiar to many people who've looked after a loved one with dementia. There's no question that this set of experiences is going to change Annika's life. It seems to me incredibly cruel how often people's lives are dictated by negative experiences in childhood, and Annika's life really shows this. Becoming a nun to get away from her childhood, only for that to become the very thing that means she's the one who ultimately saves her mother, and presumably ends up looking after her until she dies. Now that the other 3 siblings are dead, the house and anything else her mother owned would now go to Annika. Except that the house is burned down with her siblings inside it. Hopefully they had insurance, in which case Annika and her mother will at least be sorted financially. This would mean that Annika could probably afford to put her mother in a home, something the siblings discussed early on in the film, but deemed too expensive. But I just can't imagine Annika doing that, especially once she's gone along with the religious urge to save her mother with her love. Saying that sentence made me feel a bit sick. I'm definitely not an Annika. I can see Annika setting them up in a little cottage, maybe, with herself on the top floor and Harriet on the bottom. The vicar burned up in the fire as well, I believe, but presumably the church will send a new one and they'll both go along to all his services. And thus Annika's life will be dictated by her earthly mother and her heavenly father. Will she come to resent this? Possibly. People often seem to think that the super-religious are immune to normal personality traits, but they're really not. I think she'll stick with it though, both her mother and her religion, despite the difficulties. Partly because she's the kind of person who'd do that anyway. She found the love for the evil inside her mother, but also because she's just had her religious beliefs backed up. Doubt is a part of faith. Anyone who's been in a religious community will know this. In fact, I don't think faith can exist without doubt. Without doubt, you wouldn't need to have faith, only belief. In order for faith to be faith, it needs to be tested. And boy, has Annika's faith been tested recently. But it's also been upheld, and some of her religious beliefs, which are perhaps the most disbelieved by most people, such as the devil being a literal entity and possession being a real thing that happens, have just been backed up. This will add to her religious conviction and make her even more likely to look after her mother. It will also probably make her terrified of the rest of the world. She'd already spent most of her adult life in a convent. Now she's going to be spending it with her mother, sequestered away in whatever little house she buys. Unless the convent provides accommodation for them, which is probably possible, and if they offered, I'm pretty sure she'd take it. Because once a religion has saved you from something, it's then really hard to back away from it, even if elements of it make no sense to you, and even if it's actively harmful. Once again, I have a story from my own life to illustrate this. Do you see why I love horror movies? It's basically like watching bits of my life play out on screen. When I was a child, my mother and I were living in temporary accommodation whilst escaping from my violent criminal father. Unfortunately, it's called temporary for more than one reason, both because you're only meant to be there while they find you a more permanent living arrangement, but also in our case because it was built in that odd, flat-packed feeling prefab style so prominent in the UK in the 1950s. I didn't think you were that old, Shindy. I'm not. This was the 80s, and that was the problem. Prefabs were built in the wake of World War II, when so many houses had been destroyed that there wasn't enough space to house people, and so they needed somewhere to go whilst proper housing stock was rebuilt. Which it was, for the most part, but a lot of the prefabs remained. And while they weren't viewed as fit for living in for most people, if you were homeless, it's often what you were given. Which is sort of fine and makes sense, beggars can't be choosers. But the fact that they were still being used as overflow housing stock in the late 1980s became problematic when they started falling down, which ours did while we were living in it, rendering us homeless again. At which point my mother, homeless with a small child, did what she swore she'd never do again, and called her mother. They'd been estranged by this point for the best part of 2 decades. My grandmother had never met me. I don't think she even knew I existed. To my grandmother's credit, she did agree to take us in. Slightly to her discredit, however, she imposed a condition, that my mother join the fundamentalist cult my grandmother was in. So she did. And because the people there were kind in that way cult members have of wrapping you up inside their fold and rendering you entirely dependent on them, my mother just went deeper and deeper in, and never left. Which meant that when I left at 18, I was disowned and shunned by everyone I knew, but that's a different story. I think Annika's psychological response could easily be similar to my mother's, though. Given a religious event saving her life and Harriet's, and given that she was already pretty devoted to a religious life to begin with, Annika's faith might well reach a level that turns into something solid and concrete. Which might work out well for her, or might not, but regardless, it'll dictate the rest of her life. People used to ask me if I'd tried to get my mother out of the cult, and I never did. Partly that's because I think it would have been a fruitless effort, but also because I actually think it works for her. She has a life she enjoys and finds fulfilling, and she's surrounded by people who love her and take care of her. That's great from her perspective. Why would I want to take that away? And I guess that's another thing I believe which this film brings up and challenges. I think there are different ways of loving people and different ways of forgiving them. My mother was not good at being a parent, to put it mildly, but the more I've learned about her, the more I understand how she ended up doing the things she did. That doesn't mean I think it's okay that she was violently abusive, but it does mean I sort of understand on some level and have made peace with some of it, which is a kind of forgiveness which goes part of the way, but not all the way. A lot of people, when they say forgiveness, seem to be talking about absolution, release from guilt, release from responsibility for one's actions. I don't think that's appropriate, definitely not in the case of child abuse. But I do think it's sometimes appropriate and sometimes healing to try to understand people and forgive them to the extent of recognising that we're all human and that to some degree we all fuck up. While they're in the living room earlier on in the film, the siblings talk about the various ways in which they have fucked up. This activates Mother's demonic noises and excites whatever devil is living inside her. But it also gives us a look at how even these people who haven't necessarily done anything super egregious have still done things they should take responsibility for. Yes, even Annika, who turned away her brother Martin when he came to the convent asking for a place to dry out and get himself off the drugs for good. We learn also how Martin came to rely on drugs, partly as a result of his childhood, sure, but also because he murdered their father on William's instruction. Now, personally, I'd say their father deserved to be taken out by one of the kids he'd abused, but I can say that flippantly because I've never killed anyone, and therefore I don't have a lived understanding of the toll that can take on a person. Annika's learned all this about her siblings, has had to face up to the consequences of not allowing Martin to stay at the convent when he asked, and ultimately is going to have to face living with the mother who mistreated her as a child. And now that the rest of them are dead, Harriet's going to be Annika's responsibility for the rest of her life. I land somewhere ambiguous with how Annika's life will turn out as a result of all the things we've talked about in this episode. If she takes on the responsibility of looking after her mother, then it will define certainly the remainder of her life while Harriet's still alive, and probably beyond that too. Her devotion to her religion will define a lot of it as well. But that's not necessarily a good or bad thing in and of itself. Lots of people who care for sick loved ones find fulfilment in the process, even though it's stressful and really difficult. Likewise, whilst cloistered life might seem overly restrictive to many of us, for some people that's exactly what they want. In fact, I have a friend who was a nun for 12 years who wrote a memoir about her experience, which I only remembered because I just said the word cloistered, which is its title. I'll put a link in the show notes. Will Annika find happiness, contentment, fulfilment, a life that works for her? For me, that remains open-ended. The potential's there, but it depends on how she responds to everything that's happened to her, not just to the newly acquired responsibility of looking after Harriet, but also to the grief for her siblings, the guilt over not helping Martin, the feelings that will be brought up by the local vicar dying in a fire caused by the devil that was living inside her mother. Look, life's complicated, and all we can really do is try to make something of it amongst whatever weird chaos we're dealt, which hopefully Annika will be able to do. What do you think? The Voices of Our Mother was directed by Mark O'Brien, who also played William. It came out in 2014. Our final girl Annika was played beautifully by Georgina Reilly. You can follow the podcast on Instagram at ThatFinalGirlLife or support us on patreon.com/ThatFinalGirlLife. If you have any suggestions for future episodes, you can email them to thatfinalgirllife@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, remember, the horrors persist. But so do we.